Okay, so for new listeners this morning, I'm Kate Joyner. I'm Head of Governance for a multi-academy trust, and I also do governance consultancy. But one of the reasons why I met with Nick and it was so useful for me is because I also have ADHD that wasn't diagnosed until I was 40. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Nick?
Yeah, so my name's Nick. I'm a leadership coach. I've been in this industry for about 18 months, but have been in roles that involve coaching for years and years and years. And coaching was something that had a profound effect on my career, which is why I stepped into it 18 months ago. During the course of the last year, I've coached 3 people with ADHD and become more and more curious about how it shows up, and also extremely curious about how society reacts to it. And I'm sure we'll come into that a little bit later on. And we met through a networking group that we're both part of, which focuses on bridging the gap between business and education, which is something that we're both really passionate about. And we can both see from almost not quite, but opposite sides of the coin, how big a gap that is. Thankfully, this group is making huge inroads into that. And I think that's where our joint kind of enthusiasm for each other's perspective has come from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think networking was something I was a bit unsure of before I got into it. So I'm very new to networking, but I kind of assumed that it would be lots of people trying to sell you things. But what I was most surprised about is that actually it's lots of people that really want to support you, like you've supported me. So it's been really, really helpful group. What I'm trying to get out of this podcast is to kind of get a little bit out there about what ADHD is and the fact that it's not limiting. So I think so many people think that ADHD will limit your career opportunities, and I really don't think that's the case at all. And I think having your perspective in terms of how you work with people that have got ADHD and harness their skills, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's just such a fascinating area for me, because I think society at large is still coming to terms with it. I think a lot of the bias towards ADHD is quite negative, because it's seen as a problem. And children with ADHD, for example, we're typically in years gone by described as the naughty children. Well, they're not. And what I'm really curious about, and something we've touched on in previous conversations, is how ADHD shows up for individuals, especially adults and especially women. In a way that can be so powerful and so positive. And I think that's something I really want to explore more and more and more.
And I think we are becoming more aware of a society as what ADHD is and what it isn't, but there is still that perception that if you've got ADHD, and I've had people say it to me, oh, you're not bouncing around, you're not physically really active. And I'm not, but in women it shows up as real cognitive hyperactivity. So my brain is constantly going. But I very definitely see it as a different ability rather than a disability. And working in education, I'm really keen that we support our children coming through that are neurodiverse, because actually they are our future leaders. So when you're working in your leadership coach capacity, how do you support people that have got ADHD to realise their strengths and help with perhaps some of their executive function? So I could write an amazing plan looking long term, but I really struggle to keep organised. My desk is a mess. So it's that real contradiction. So how do you work with people to try and overcome that?
Okay. Structure is something that a lot of the material I've read on coaching people with ADHD leans into first and foremost, because structure isn't necessarily something that comes immediately and easily to people with ADHD because of that high functioning brain pattern that they've got. The brain's constantly whirring. So introducing models and coping strategies that can help, and they can be quite unique to each person. So things like Eisenhower's matrix to be able to prioritise tasks, time blocking to allow focus, which coupled with something like the Pomodoro technique would give someone with ADHD a real clear window of time to be focused in, with a reward at the end of it, because a lot of that does depend on the dopamine kind of fluctuation that ADHD people have. I think I mentioned it's unique, and I can give a really good example here. A client I had last year, very pronounced ADHD, very open about it. And we were struggling to find the right solution from a structure point of view. And we stumbled upon the fact that numbers were their go-to, So if it had numbers in it, they were able to apply themselves really, really easily. And what that meant was we could start to enumerate some of the tasks that they would shy away from. And that was hugely powerful. It made such a difference to that person in terms of doing the things they would normally leave on a to-do list and never get to. But by giving them a numerical element, it was almost attracting them to the task, which was a really great experience. So that was quite a powerful way of doing something quite unique for that particular person.
Is the uniqueness a challenge for you as a leadership coach? Because absolutely, it's about identifying what works for that person, isn't it? And numbers clearly did for that person. For me, absolutely would not, because numbers are not my thing at all. So is that quite a challenge as a leadership coach to deal with that individuality?
For me, not in the slightest. And one of the things that I think I would use as my kind of USPs if I'm talking to people who potentially I might be working with is the fact that my approach is very client-led. So if I'm working with someone, I want to understand what they want from coaching, what they want to achieve, their outcomes, their desired goals, their ambitions, and then we tailor the program accordingly.
Yeah.
So the uniqueness actually just fits really nicely into the way that I work with my clients, and that's not something that I shy away from in any way, shape or form. If anything, it makes the experience that much richer.
Yeah. So. What do you think are some of the things that you've discovered about ADHD that you didn't know before working with people with it in your leadership capacity?
I think one of the things that's most striking is the fact that society paints this picture and doesn't shine a light on how ADHD shows up to be such a positive thing in someone's life, and how that can often differentiate them in terms of the way they think. So if you think about some of those executive functions like creativity, people with ADHD often show up in a very different way in that space. I've read in a couple of different articles that I've been researching that ADHD lends itself to people in sales. And I had a client last year who was a brilliant salesperson because of the energy they brought to their chosen profession. And that set them apart from their peers and their competitors. So I think that's one of the biggest things I've learned. What I've also learned is that this is just as wide, as deep, as long as you want it to be. There is so much to learn, so much information out there. And one of the things that I think about quite a lot is when working with people with ADHD, not falling into the societal trap of trying to fix. And that's very much a coach's mantra anyway. We're not here to fix people. How can I help the person that I'm working with to show up in a way that's going to really benefit them and their career, and the role that they're carrying out, to harness what they've got? Because I'm not qualified to be able to address ADHD and change their personality, but I am qualified to be able to give them ways of managing it, ways of using it productively, and also understanding it so they know when it shows up for good or bad.
And I think that being able to identify what your traits are is really important. And I think I've had a lot of people say to me when I say I've got ADHD that actually working in governance, that can't be very good for your ADHD. But actually it's perfect for me because it's a real mixture of routine, which I do tend to shy away from routine, but I actually need that routine to function. But I also like being able to take on new projects, which I tend to be able to do in governance, particularly as head of governance. I've got some autonomy about how I drive it across the business, which I really love. So how do you work with your clients in terms of trying to get them a balance between routine and then also capturing their spontaneity in a positive way?
I think, firstly, before I answer the question, one thing that you just did there, which I'll call out because it's something I've noticed, is that people who have ADHD have got huge amounts of self-awareness. Mm-hmm. So they understand how it works for them. They understand triggers, but they also understand when they're at their best. Yeah. And that can be really useful. How do I work with people? In a lot of ways, it's no different to working with any other client. So I start from a position of understanding what they want to achieve. So we call that contracting.
Yep.
So that's working out between us what the outcomes are that you're looking for, what your ambitious goals are, what would work for you in terms of a way of working, what might trigger you in terms of making you less productive, understanding the obstacles that might come in the way. So I spend a lot of time in that space, understanding the client, understanding what's going to work for them, so that by the time we're working on what you would consider to be the normal sessions, I've got a clear idea of how the client wants to work. And that allows me then to support their journey. And I talk about the toolkit that I use. I've got a big toolkit, invisible toolkit, sat down next to me, which I can pick things out as conversations develop. Mm. So it's not prescribed or pre-thought out. It's very much about being agile and listening to the client. And every session I have with a client, the expectation that I have of them is they bring something for me. They bring something to discuss that they want to address, and that might be something we've mapped out at the beginning of the program. It might be something that's just happened, that's really kind of brought, for example, ADHD to the surface, and they've had a particularly bad experience or something, or it could be a really good experience they want to understand better. Yeah. So it's about contracting and then being quite agile about the way that I work with the client.
And I think that's really important because ADHD isn't static. Mm-hmm. And I think certainly I felt being diagnosed later in life, initially I was really relieved that actually I've been trying to fix myself. You know, why can't I stay organised? Why do I forget things? You know, it was really frustrating. And so it was relief to know that actually it didn't matter how many notebooks I had, I still wasn't going to be that way inclined. But then I went through a bit of a almost grief. And I know that sounds really melodramatic, but I really felt like, oh, okay, there was still hope before. If I buy this new notebook, this will be the notebook that gets me really organised. And then all of a sudden that hope was gone because I was going to have to live with this forever because this is how my brain is wired. So I think working with somebody that will move with how you're feeling and how you develop. And I think certainly now I'm at a point in my life where I can use my ADHD much more as my superpower than I was before. So having somebody that can take that journey with me is so important.
I'm quite intrigued by what you've said there because the word superpower is one that we've used in conversations already. What does that look like for you? What are your ADHD superpowers and how do they show up?
I think for me, it's seeing the big picture. So I can see, if I have an idea, I can see exactly how it will look like in Technicolor. Like doing this podcast, for example, I imagined this perhaps 6 months ago and I knew exactly what it would look like and I knew what it would bring and I knew how I was going to get there. It's the detail that I struggle with. But big picture, I'm your woman. And ideas, I can think of ideas that other people are like, where did that come from? Because I just see things differently. So I will come up with an idea and I will run with it. And I often laugh because I should have known at this point I had ADHD because I was told probably about 10, 12 years ago by one of my managers who wrote in my annual appraisal, Kate doesn't let convention get in the way of what is otherwise a good idea. And that is it. And I think I joke as well that my husband always says, the words that make his blood run cold is, I've had an idea, because he knows it will be a good one. So definitely ideas for me, and I will then hyper-focus on those ideas. And hyper-focus is another superpower of mine. So when I get really into something, I can do perhaps 4 days work in a couple of hours because I will just focus so intently on what I'm doing at the time, which is really helpful. Slight on the side of that is the fact that having a deadline helps with that. So quite often I'll wait until the deadline, but then I'll produce my best work. And I was very much like that at school. I remember having a project to do. I'd had about 4 weeks to do it, I think. And I waited until the Sunday before the day it was due in. And I just blasted for 4 hours and got it all done and was really happy with it because I just super focused on it. And I got an A. And I'm sure that was very irritating to some of my friends that I'd left it to the last minute. But I have to accept that's how I am and try not to push against it.
That's really interesting. I was curious there about the way that it shows up for you in terms of those superpowers, but behind that is some opportunities where you're going to need some help. How do you get support for the bits that aren't necessarily where you would find your most comfort? So the detail and so on. How do you set that up so that you can cover every base?
That one is really new to me because I wasn't diagnosed until sort of a couple of years ago. I thought it was a weakness to say I can't do that or I'm not very good at that, and I would make myself do it. And now I've kind of come to terms with where I am with my ADHD. I have now been able, and I've been very fortunate to be able to create a team around me, and I've deliberately recruited people that have got the skills that I'm lacking, so that as a team we are really strong because they have got that attention to detail. They do think methodically. So I can sit with them and say, I've had this idea, this is where I want to be, and they will help me map out how we're going to get there, and they will perhaps take on some of the things that they enjoy and that they're good at, and then I can do the things that I enjoy and that I'm good at. And I think that's one of the key things that I'm so excited to work with you on is actually how do I stop? I've spent whole of my life really trying to build on my weaknesses, and I think that was the wrong strategy. What I want to work with you on is actually how do I maximise my strengths? Because I think that would be much more powerful in achieving things than trying to support my weaknesses, which I think is probably an unrealistic expectation anyway.
And I don't think that applies to people with ADHD. There's a concept called the personal boardroom, and that basically is where you would create a boardroom around you of people who complement what you are and who you are and how you show up. So focusing on your strengths. And then having people who can pick up the things that you're not so good at is absolutely the right thing to do. And in a role like yours, where you've got a team of people around you, it makes perfect sense. So actually, it's a great thing that you've done. I'm also curious, actually, about, you mentioned that you can, when you're kind of really focused in the zone, you can get through a lot of work in a short space of time. How do you create an environment to make that happen?
I don't. It's a simple answer. So if you came, I'm very fortunate to generally work from home, which is really helpful to me because I do get, if I was in a room full of lots of people all the time, I would get very distracted and get involved in lots of other things rather than focusing on what I need to be doing. So I work from home. My desk is a mess. It looks like a tornado's been through it, but I can tell you exactly where everything is. So what I tend to do when I'm hyper-focusing is I will just focus on what I'm doing. I can't see anything around me. I could walk over something that's on the floor 10 times and I wouldn't even notice it because I'm just so hyper-focused on what I'm trying to achieve at the time. That can sometimes be distracting for family because we do this thing where we put things on the stairs thinking that someone will take it up. Well, I won't take it up because I don't see it. So it's very important, I think, to work and understand those things about yourself so that actually when you're living with other people or working with other people as well, that actually you can make those compromises. So my husband has got the patience of a saint, he really has. But I know for him, one of the things he really struggles with is when we come back from holiday, I would leave the suitcase on the floor and I'd walk over it for 2 weeks until I'd pulled everything out of it that I needed and everything had gone in the wash. Drives him mad. So I make a real effort when we come home that I don't sit down because once I've sat down, that's it. You're not getting me up again. And we empty the suitcase. And it's about, I think, understanding my ADHD more means that I know where I can compromise and where I can't. And it's not because I don't want to, I physically can't. And I think that would be something that would be really good to unpack with you more. Although it would be perhaps focused on a work environment rather than home, the same strategies will work with both. And I think that will be a really important part of our work together.
I think what I found interesting there is that the environment isn't a physical one, but it's a mental, almost psychological one in terms of giving you that absolute clarity at that point in time to get on with what you want to get on with. And the fact that your desk may be a mess or whatever is kind of immaterial. The one thing I did pick up on, which I thought was interesting, was your acknowledgement that if you were in an office environment with other people, it would be incredibly distracting. So having that almost exclusion zone where you're on your own, and within that it may look like someone's thrown a hand grenade in there in terms of how tidy it is, but that's not important because you have that space and time to be hyper focused.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting.
And do you work with your clients on that? Because we are where I work now in the process of moving back into offices. So I won't be there permanently, but I will be there. And because I've not shared a space for a long time, it is something that I'm thinking I need to make sure that my environment is clean and tidy, at least to the point where it doesn't distract others.
Yeah.
So have you worked with clients before that have kind of experienced that?
Not specifically, but already I'm thinking to myself, how do we work on creating opportunities for you to collaborate in a space where you've got to share with other people in a way that's going to suit you and suit them. And there's a whole range of questions which are unanswered. You might be in an office with other people who have similar challenges and similar ways of thinking. You might be in an office with people who are completely the opposite and like everything to be, clear desk policy and all that kind of thing. So it's understanding the shared environment and then understanding what you can do. I think it's about seeing how far you can go with compromise without with it not being to the detriment of you and the way you work. And likewise the same for the people around you. So I think that would be one that we could explore, and as you get to understand that shared environment and the people around you, how you can make it work best for all of you.
And I think that is probably something that certainly I have done in the past, is you try and make yourself small, because you might be impacting on other people by the way you are. It's a constant cycle of saying, I'm sorry. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about it now, because working in education, we're seeing increasing numbers of children with ADHD, with ASD, with other neurodiversities. And I don't want them to spend their whole lives apologising for who they are. And so building that environment for them to excel, I'm hoping that if I learn what works for me, I can share some of those strategies. And by law of averages, we're going to have some staff that are undiagnosed or even late diagnosed. They do know, but they've never really kind of touched on it. Is working in the education space something you've done, or do you work with people across sectors?
It's across sectors for sure. One thing before I answer your question that really came to mind then was what a great opportunity you've got to take the people you share an office space on a bit of a journey to understand how you can work with them. Because I did kind of die inside a moment when you said, I'm just going to say sorry. I've been saying sorry. That's really sad. And I will retain that information because it will be something that I'll think about as our journey progresses. My experience is across all sectors, but I do have a particular passion for education, and that's based on, as we mentioned right at the beginning, that bridging that gap between education and business. I've been a school governor at a first primary school in a tough catchment area as well, which was fascinating. I had the privilege of being on the panel for appointing a head teacher, which was I still say it now, one of the best experiences I've ever had. And then when I spend time in schools, and I'm in schools probably at least 2 to 3 times a month for various reasons, it's just dialing up the curiosity and understanding what those establishments are facing into. And I go into schools that are state schools. I go into schools that are in the private sector. I go into schools that are in good catchment areas, tough catchment areas, all ends of the spectrum. And there are some themes, but there are some big differences as well. And one of the biggest differences, I think, is the people in the school itself. I see huge amounts of positivity. I see huge amounts of dedication. I also see some people who are really browbeaten, and it's tough. And that's a difficult sector to work in. And I think one of the things I can bring to the conversation is an experience from elsewhere.
Yeah.
From being in the corporate world for many years doing leadership roles. I've got experiences I can draw on that as conversations develop, I can share, give people opportunities to look at things differently and hopefully help to shape some change in some small way or another.
And I think we've spoken in the past about you perhaps coming into where I work and doing some leadership coaching with our staff as well, because I think that is really important for their career trajectory, which kind of brings me to a question that I've been wondering about. So do you just work with leaders that are kind of on the senior leadership team or have got leadership in their job title? Because I think as I've progressed in my career, I've realised the difference between managers and leaders and the difference that brings, and that not everybody who's a leader is a somebody that is on the leadership team.
You're absolutely right. There's a big distinction between the two. And, you know, on my LinkedIn bio, it says leadership coach, which can sometimes point people towards those senior roles, those C-suite roles. Interestingly, I put executive coach on there at the beginning and that seems to have disappeared probably quite organically. I've spent the last year working on one contract where I've been working with small business owners in and around this part of the world. They're all leaders, but some of them lead their organisation on their own with nobody else working there. They're still leaders.
Yeah.
I do have a sweet spot around people who are quite new in their journey. There's new managers. I've got a number of clients I'm working with at the moment that are younger managers, less experienced. And in my corporate career, those are the people I probably enjoyed working with the most, because having the ability to help and shape the early years of someone's management career is really, really gratifying, really satisfying, but also really powerful. So I will happily move between the scales. Yeah. And I think I'm able to be the kind of coach that people need, regardless of whether they're a CEO or a line manager in their first management role, because I was there once, 38 years ago, less than a mile away, at the age of 18, with the responsibility of being a manager and learning really fast that, there are ways you can get things done and there are ways that you can get things done that are long lasting. And those journeys are ones that I can dip in and out of to support a client.
Yeah. And perhaps your experience with people with ADHD as well will also help that aspect of your work as well, because actually I'm quite conscious of the fact that how am I to manage? So, I answer to the CEO. It's about equipping those people with the skills they need to be whichever leader they need to be for the staff that they're working with. And I know, and I think my CEO is very good at this, if he says you can't, he knows my next words will be, watch me. So he very definitely doesn't say that to me. So I think that would be quite a fascinating conversation to have, actually, about sort of how you see leadership developing and how they change their skills depending on who they're dealing with, and how that would change with somebody with ADHD that they're managing to get the best out of them. Because if they're utilised in the right way, they can be one of your biggest assets. Used the wrong way, they can be quite disruptive. And I will be perfectly honest that I can be that disruptive influence, not intentionally, but I can be. So that's perhaps a future one that we can dig on. But it's been such a great conversation, Nick. Thank you so much. And I've just got loads more questions, actually. So thank you for coming in this morning and talking to me a little bit about your role, and fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.